Drake Varon had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer, but nothing made his blood boil like slavers. He stalked through the auction yard, boots kicking up dust as he kept his head down, blending into the crowd of traders, mercenaries, and criminals who thrived in places like this. The air was thick with the scent of burnt metal and unwashed bodies. The heat of artificial sun lamps cast harsh shadows over rows of rusted cages, where captives huddled together, waiting to be sold like livestock. Drake had only stopped on Varick 7, a lawless moon on the fringe of civilized space, to refuel. He hadn't come looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And today trouble had green skin, wide golden eyes, and was small enough to fit in a slaver's cage. The child, no older than 5 or 6, sat curled in the corner of his prison, arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His emerald green skin shimmered under the flickering neon lights, and his short black hair stuck up in uneven tufts, as if someone had roughly cut it. His large feline-like eyes darted frantically between the jeering bidders and the towering auctioneer, a 6-limbed Rodari with a mouth full of gold-plated teeth. Drake felt his stomach twist. He knew what happened to children sold in places like this. The thought made his hands curl into fists. The Rodari auctioneer slammed the end of his staff against the ground. "A rare specimen," he bellowed. "An Ilyari child, fresh from the homeworld, young, unmarked, and highly valuable. Shall we start the bidding at 50,000 credits?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Drake's pulse pounded. Ilyari. That explained the kid's striking features. He had heard stories of the Ilyari. An elusive race, reclusive and highly advanced. They didn't often leave their planet, and when they did, they traveled in well-guarded vessels. Which meant one thing. This child was stolen. Drake didn't think. He moved. Before the Rodari could finish his pitch, Drake stepped forward, gripping the hilt of the knife hidden beneath his jacket. His other hand hovered over his blaster. The slaver noticed him and grinned, mistaking his approach for interest. "Ah, the fine eye you have, sir." The Rodari gestured toward the cage. "Strong, obedient, and still young enough to be molded. You won't find another Ilyari at such a price." Drake punched him in the mouth. The slaver's head snapped back, his gold teeth clicking together as he stumbled. A beat of stunned silence followed, then everything exploded into chaos. Shouts. Blaster fire. Bodies surging forward. Drake didn't hesitate. He lunged for the cage, grabbed the rusted bars, and yanked hard. The lock groaned but didn't break. The kid inside flinched, pressing himself against the back of the cage, his golden eyes wide with fear. "Hold on, kid," Drake muttered. He drew his blaster, aimed at the lock, and fired. The energy bolt shattered the metal and the door swung open. The child didn't move. Drake cursed. No time to explain. He reached in, grabbed the boy, and hauled him into his arms. The kid barely had time to react before Drake turned and ran. Blaster bolts whizzed past his head. Slavers shouted behind him. Someone called for reinforcements. The whole auction yard was coming apart. Traders scattering, cages tipping, stolen goods spilling into the dust. Drake sprinted toward the docking bay, dodging stray fire, his grip firm around the trembling child. The kid clung to his jacket, tiny fingers digging into the fabric, his breath coming in fast, panic bursts. "Just hold on," Drake said, more to himself than to the boy. He reached his ship, a battered but reliable freighter, the Blackthorn, and slapped the emergency ramp release. The metal platform hissed open. He charged up, blaster drawn, and fired a few warning shots at the slavers charging toward him. One ducked, another dropped, and the rest hesitated just long enough for Drake to slam the door shut behind him. The ship sealed with a heavy thunk. Silence. Drake exhaled, chest heaving. He looked down at the child still clutching his jacket. The boy was shaking, his eyes darting around the dimly lit cargo bay like a trapped animal. His small frame trembled, his breathing shallow. Drake knelt down, loosening his grip. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You're safe now." The boy didn't speak. His golden eyes locked onto Drake's face, searching, assessing. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked, "Why?" Drake hesitated. A dozen answers came to mind. "Because I hate slavers. Because I wasn't going to let them take you. Because I've seen too many kids lost to bastards like that." Instead, he just said, "Because no one deserves to be in a cage." The boy studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke again. "My name is Zyrek." Drake gave a small nod. "Nice to meet you, Zyrek." A pause. Then, in that same quiet voice, the boy added, "Mother will reward you." Drake frowned. Something in the way he said it sent a chill down his spine. Before he could ask, the ship's console beeped, an incoming transmission. Drake stood, his gut already telling him this wasn't over. He had no idea what kind of mess he had just stepped into, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. Drake expected gratitude, maybe a tearful reunion, a heartfelt thank you from a desperate parent. What he didn't expect was worship. The moment the Blackthorn touched down on Ilvaris, the Iliari homeworld, Zyrek bolted down the ramp before the engines had fully powered down. Drake followed, hand resting on his blaster, wary of an unfamiliar planet and an unknown reception. Ilvaris was stunning, too stunning. Pale violet skies stretched over silver cities that gleamed as if carved from starlight. Lush green forests spilled into the edges of civilization, their luminescent flora pulsing softly in the dimming afternoon light. Everything looked pristine, untouched by war or corruption. A place so unblemished had no business being part of the same galaxy Drake knew. He didn't trust it. A single figure stood waiting at the landing site. She was tall, elegant in a way that made Drake feel like an unwashed vagrant in comparison. Green skin like Xerax, but darker, richer. Her long black hair was woven with silver bands, marking her status, though he had no clue what they meant. Her golden eyes locked onto her son, and in the next breath, she was moving. Zyrek collided into her arms with a choked sob. Drake took a step back, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't his. He exhaled, relieved. Good, the kid's safe. Job's done, I can leave. Then she turned those piercing golden eyes on him and dropped to her knees. Drake's stomach clenched. "Oh, no, 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 get up, that's not—" She pressed her forehead to the ground before him. "You are divine," she whispered. Drake swore under his breath. "Lady, please, stand up." She didn't. Instead, she straightened just enough to raise her hands in reverence. "You saved my son. You have no idea what that means to my people." Zyrek, still clinging to her side, glanced up at Drake with something eerily close to amusement. Drake pinched the bridge of his nose. "Look, I'm just a guy who saw a kid in a cage and decided not to be a bastard about it. I'm not divine, and I sure as hell don't need anyone kneeling at my feet." The woman didn't waver. "You misunderstand," she said. "I am Corel, matriarch of the Zivath lineage. Among my people, a life debt of this magnitude is not repaid with mere thanks. We revere those who save our blood." Drake frowned. "Revere?" Her lips curled in something not quite a smile. "You are owed more than gratitude. You are owed devotion." He took a step back. "That sounds a hell of a lot like—" "Worship?" Zyrek supplied helpfully. Drake groaned. This wasn't happening. He came here to return a lost kid, not get an entire species ready to build statues of him. A murmur spread through the gathered crowd, because of course a crowd had formed. Dozens of Iliari, all watching, whispering, bowing. Some placed their hands over their chests in an unfamiliar salute. Others dropped to their knees. Drake turned to Zyrek, exasperated. "You warned me about this, didn't you?" Zyrek grinned. "I did. Smug little gremlin." Carl rose to her feet, towering over him with quiet regality. "You misunderstand, Drake Varan. Worship is not a burden among my people. It is a privilege." Drake definitely didn't like the sound of that. "I don't need privileges," he muttered. "I need fuel and a flight path out of here." Her golden gaze sharpened. "You would reject what is freely given?" Drake ran a hand through his hair. He'd faced bounty hunters, pirates, and warlords, but this woman, this calm, unshakable force, had him at a loss. "Look," he said, trying another angle. "You're grateful. I get that. But worship is a little excessive, don't you think?" Carl's expression didn't change. "You saved my son. Among my people, such an act is beyond honor. It is holiness." Drake swore again, and that was when things got worse. A group of Ilyari elders approached, adorned in flowing robes, their faces unreadable. One of them, a man with silver markings down his arms, stepped forward. "This is the one?" His voice carried the weight of authority. Carell nodded. "He is." The elder turned to Drake and bowed. "It is our highest honor to recognize you as one of us." Drake crossed his arms. "I'm not one of you." "You are now," Carell said simply. He stared at her. She meant it. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. He was in deep. And then, as if the universe hadn't messed with him enough today, Carell took a step closer, tilting her head. "You do not wish to be honored?" Drake exhaled. "What about marriage?" she interrupted. Drake choked. What?" "In my culture, those we worship we also cherish. You saved my son, and I cannot fathom a future without you. If you are to be here, then let us be as mates." Drake stared at her, speechless for the first time in his life. Then he looked down at Zyrek, who was watching him with far too much enjoyment. "Would you be my father?" the boy asked, golden eyes wide with innocent mischief. Drake groaned. This was not how he expected his day to go. Drake Varan had survived impossible odds before, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this. For 3 days, the Ilari treated him like a living legend. Everywhere he went, people bowed their heads in silent reverence. Strangers murmured his name as if afraid to speak too loudly in his presence. Gifts appeared outside his quarters. Hand-woven tapestries, carved crystal figures, exotic fruits wrapped in silk. At first, he tried to return them, but the Ilari only looked insulted when he did. "Well, to the Satan?" At meals, entire families stopped eating just to watch him, their expressions caught between admiration and awe. Children peeked from behind their parents' robes, their golden eyes wide with wonder, as if expecting him to summon fire from his palms or walk on air. It unnerved him. Drake had been many things in his life. A smuggler, a fighter, a man who could talk his way out of most trouble and punch through the rest. But never once had he been a symbol. Never had people knelt at his feet as if he had descended from the stars just to save them. And Carell simply expected it. She didn't push, didn't demand he accept their customs, but she also didn't question them. In her mind, this was how things were. He had saved her son. Among her people, that meant he was worthy of devotion. To reject it was unthinkable. Drake tried reasoning with her, tried explaining that, where he came from, hero worship wasn't a thing. He wasn't special. He was just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. She listened, patient as ever. Then, after he finished, she simply said, "That does not change what you are to us." And that was the end of it. Zyrek at least found it amusing. The boy followed Drake everywhere, his admiration less worshipful and more enthusiastic mimicry. He copied the way Drake stood, the way he crossed his arms, even the way he grumbled under his breath when something annoyed him. At one point, Drake caught the kid leaning against a wall in the exact same pose he used when lost in thought. "I don't stand like that," Drake muttered. "Yes, you do," Zyrek answered without hesitation. Drake ran a hand down his face. "Stars help me, I'm being studied." The boy grinned. The worst part, Drake didn't hate it. He told himself he was only sticking around to make sure Zyrek stayed safe. The kid had been kidnapped once. Who was to say someone wouldn't try again? But deep down, Drake knew there was something else keeping him here. Something he didn't want to name. One evening he found himself standing beside Karel on a high balcony overlooking the city. The twin moons of Ilvaris hung low in the sky, their silver glow casting long shadows over the polished stone streets. Below, families gathered in quiet circles, speaking in hushed voices, offering small gifts to the stars as part of an evening ritual. Drake exhaled. So, this whole worship the guy who saves a kid thing, it's permanent? Carl turned to face him, her gaze as steady as ever. It is not worship in the way you fear. He gave her a look. People bow when I walk by. She tilted her head. Would it bother you if I bowed? He stiffened. Yes. How? Because you're not... He stopped, searching for the right words. Because I don't want that from you. She stepped closer, studying his face as if measuring his soul. And what do you want from me, Drake Varen? His pulse jumped. He looked away, pretending to focus on the city below. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Finally, he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, no bowing, no altars, no weird morning chants in my name. Carl nodded once. Agreed. Drake relaxed. Then she spoke again. What about marriage? Drake choked. What? She lifted a single brow as if puzzled by his reaction. It is the natural progression. In what galaxy is that a natural progression? He demanded. Caro's lips curved ever so slightly. Among my people, we do not separate reverence from affection. We cherish those we honor. You saved my son. I cannot fathom a future without you. Drake wasn't breathing. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it was the most logical conclusion in the world, as if she had simply decided and now the universe would fall in line. Drake could handle gunfights, bar brawls, and high-speed chases, but this was dangerous. He stepped back, needing space. Listen, I think there's been some kind of... Would you be my father? Zyrek's voice cut through the moment like a blade through ice. Drake froze. The kid stood a few feet away, watching him with those big golden eyes. Hopeful, expectant, completely unaware of the absolute panic currently gripping Drake's soul. He turned to Corel in desperation, but she just waited, unshaken, as if she already knew the answer. Drake let out a strangled groan and dragged a hand down his face. This is not how my life was supposed to go. Karel smiled, the first true smile he had seen from her. You say that now, she murmured. And for some stupid, infuriating reason, a part of him knew she was right. Drake Varen had survived ambushes, betrayals, and near-death experiences, but domestic life on Ilvaris? That was proving to be his greatest challenge yet. He wasn't sure how it happened. One moment he was arguing that marriage was not part of the deal, and the next he had a home in the HYF estate, a room larger than his entire ship, and an official title he couldn't pronounce. Karel's people worked fast. By the end of the first week, the Iliari had entirely reorganized his life, without his permission. His clothes had been replaced with tailored robes woven from some silk-like material that adjusted to temperature. His meals were prepared by hand, since apparently a savior should not eat machine-processed food, and to his utter horror, the Iliari had built a meditation chamber in his honor, a shrine with an actual glowing statue of him. That was the last straw. Karel! He stormed into the grand hall, waving an exasperated hand toward the shrine some poor architects had just finished assembling. What in the burning hells is that? She glanced up from where she was seated, unbothered as ever. Your likeness, of course. The people wanted a symbol of your presence. Drake ran a hand through his hair, struggling for patience. I told you, I don't need a damn statue. Regal nodded in serene agreement. And yet, it is already done. He opened his mouth, then closed it, fighting the urge to argue with someone who clearly had no intention of listening. This was his life now. At least Zyrek was enjoying himself. The kid had fully embraced having Drake around, treating him like both a personal bodyguard and an older brother. He followed him through the estate, clinging to his side during public gatherings and insisting they train together every morning in the courtyard. And training with an Ilyari child was a whole new nightmare. Zyrek, despite his size, had ridiculous reflexes. His species was built for speed, agility, and an unnatural ability to predict movement. At first, Drake thought, hey, the kid's small. This'll be easy. 5 minutes later, he was flat on his back with a smug green child standing over him. "You fight like a human," Zyrek declared, hands on his hips. Drake groaned. "I am human." "That's the problem," the boy teased before offering a hand. Drake took it, yanked him forward, and pinned him with a smirk. "Still human enough to win." Zyrek scowled before laughing, bright and carefree. It was too easy to like the kid. Too easy to imagine that this life was something he could get used to. That thought should have terrified him. Instead, it just made him tired. The days stretched into weeks, and before he knew it, he was part of the rhythm of Ilvaris. He learned their customs, their traditions, their strange way of seeing the universe. He stopped flinching every time someone bowed, even if he still hated it. He discovered the Ilyari didn't just worship with words, but with actions, by offering kindness in ways both large and small. One evening, an elderly Ilyari woman appeared at his door, pressing a delicately carved pendant into his hand. "A protection," she murmured before walking away. Another day, a group of children ran up and placed fresh petals in his pockets. An Ilyari gesture of well-being. It wasn't mindless worship, it was genuine gratitude, expressed through their culture. And that somehow was even harder to refuse. The only one who never bowed was Karo. She moved through the world with certainty, standing beside him as an equal, never yielding. Drake told himself he didn't like that about her. That was a lie. But just when he started to adjust, reality decided to kick him in the teeth. It happened during a formal gathering, one of those ceremonial meetings where Drake was supposed to stand there and look important while the Ilyari leaders discussed politics. He was half listening, sipping something that tasted vaguely alcoholic, when an urgent transmission came through on Karel's personal communicator. The room fell silent as she took the call. Her expression didn't change, but Drake saw the tightening of her grip, the subtle tension in her posture. Something was wrong. She ended the call and turned to him. "You need to come with me," she said, voice controlled but urgent. Drake immediately followed. They moved through the halls, past towering crystal-lit corridors until they reached a secured chamber. The doors slid open, revealing a holographic transmission hovering in the center of the room. Drake's stomach dropped. The image flickered, but the message was clear. A bounty notice. His face. A reward so high it made his past bounties look like pocket change. And at the bottom, stamped in bold crimson letters, the name of the faction that had issued it. The Rodari Syndicate. The same slavers he had stolen Zyrek from. Karel turned to him, golden eyes sharp. "They want you alive." Drake cursed under his breath. Of course they did. Stealing a valuable child was one thing, but publicly humiliating the slavers by rescuing him, that was a debt they intended to collect. Zyrek. Drake immediately reached for his comm. "Where's the kid?" "Safe," Karel assured him. "For now." He exhaled sharply, shoving a hand through his hair. "They'll come here, sooner or later." Karel's expression didn't waver. "Let them try." She said it with certainty, like an absolute fact, as if no force in the universe could threaten her home, her son, her people. Drake should have argued. He should have insisted on running, on taking Zyrek somewhere safe before things escalated. Instead, he found himself standing taller, his old instincts flaring to life. Running had always been his first instinct. But this time he wasn't going anywhere. Drake Varen had always been a man who left no footprints behind. Every place he touched was temporary, every connection fleeting. He never stayed long enough to make an impact. never let himself get entangled in the lives of others. But Elvira's had a way of pulling him in. It started with small things, trivial, insignificant moments that should have meant nothing. Like the coffee. Iliari culture thrived on balance, order, and patience, which meant caffeine was practically a foreign concept. Their bodies operated with precise metabolic efficiency, and anything that stimulated their system was deemed unnecessary, uncivilized even. So when Drake introduced Karel to coffee, he expected a polite refusal. Instead, she took one sip, let it settle on her tongue, and then stared at him like he had just handed her the key to intergalactic domination. "You drink this every day?" she asked. "Several times," he admitted, watching her with mild amusement. She took another sip, slower this time, and then placed the cup down with deliberate care, as if she had just made a dangerous discovery. "I see now why humans are impossible to control," she said. Drake laughed. "That's the secret, all right. Just keep us caffeinated and slightly pissed off." By the end of the week, council elders were holding secret meetings to discuss the societal impact of stimulant consumption. Meanwhile, Karel had started drinking a cup every morning, never addressing it, never acknowledging that he had been the one to introduce her to it. Then there was the humor problem. Iliari didn't do sarcasm. Their species was built on linguistic precision, their language filled with layered diplomacy and subtle complexities. So when Drake made a dry remark, they either took him dead seriously or spent an alarming amount of time trying to decipher the hidden meaning. At one formal gathering, an elder asked if he required anything. Drake, exhausted by the endless reverence, muttered, "Yeah, a ship and a fast exit." The elder nodded solemnly. "It will take time to arrange, but we will ensure safe passage when necessary." Drake choked on his drink. Karel exhaled, rubbing her temples. "He is joking," she clarified. The elder frowned. "This is a human behavior?" "Unfortunately," Karel muttered. Drake smirked. "You'll get used to it." By the next council meeting, an elder attempted humor of their own. "I've requested additional storage halls for the grain reserves," he announced. Then, with a completely straight face, he added, "unless you believe we should fill them with air and watch them remain empty." Silence. Drake bit his cheek to stop himself from laughing as the other elders stared in horror. Carol shot him a deadly look. "This is your fault," she whispered. Drake grinned. "I regret nothing." But nothing had caused a greater disruption than Zyrek's peanut butter obsession. Drake had introduced him to human food out of boredom, fully expecting the kid to turn his nose up at it. Instead, Zyrek had taken one bite of peanut butter and declared it the greatest discovery in the history of the galaxy. By the end of the month, entire shipments of peanut butter had been imported to Ilvaris, and the elders were formally discussing its role in trade agreements. Drake had, entirely by accident, altered the Iliari food economy. Yet despite all the chaos, he was changing too. He found himself adopting Iliari customs without realizing it. He waited for the twin moons to rise before making major decisions, unconsciously respecting their belief in timing and fate. He stopped flinching every time someone placed their hand over their heart, a silent gesture of deep gratitude. And Karel, calling him chosen of the stars, she simply said his name. The first time it happened, they were standing on a high balcony, watching the deep violet sky fade into the glow of Ilvaris's twin moons. She had turned to him, her expression unreadable, and simply said, "Drake." No title, no reverence, just him. He hadn't known how to respond, so he said nothing. But something shifted in that moment, something neither of them acknowledged. It lingered between them, silent but undeniable. And maybe, just maybe, that was why he wasn't running anymore. But just as he was beginning to accept this strange new life, reality came crashing down. It happened during an official meeting. One of those formal assemblies where he was expected to stand there and look important while the council discussed politics, trade, and planetary security. He was half listening, swirling a drink in his hand, when Carell's personal communicator lit up with an urgent transmission. The air in the room changed instantly. Carell took the call, voice calm and controlled, but Drake could see the tension in her fingers as she gripped the device. Something was wrong. She ended the transmission and turned to him. "You need to come with me. Now." Drake followed without hesitation. They walked through the ornate corridors, past towering, crystal-lit walls, until they reached a secured chamber deep within the estate. The moment the doors slid open, Drake felt his stomach drop. A holographic transmission hovered in the center of the room, glowing in cold blue light. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the message, and then he saw his own face. A bounty notice. His name. His location. A reward so high it made his past bounties look like petty pocket change. And at the bottom, stamped in bold crimson letters, the name of the faction that had issued it. The Rodari Syndicate. The same slavers he had humiliated, the same ones he had stolen Zyrek from. Carl turned to him, voice measured but sharp. "They want you alive." Drake let out a slow breath. Of course they did. Stealing a valuable child was one thing, but publicly disgracing them? That was personal. They would never let it go. His first instinct was to run, to grab Zyrek, get back to his ship, and disappear before the Rodari could get close. But then he looked at Carell, at the steady, unwavering determination in her eyes. At the world that had somehow, against all odds, become a place he didn't want to leave. And for the first time in his life, Drake Varen wasn't running. He turned to Carell, jaw set. "They'll come here," he said, "sooner or later." Carell's expression didn't waver. "Let them try." She said it like a promise, not just to him but to the entire world that stood behind her. And for the first time in his entire damn life, Drake Varen wasn't looking for an escape. He was ready for a fight. Drake Varen had always known his past would catch up to him. He just hadn't expected it to happen while sitting in a damn council meeting, drinking some expensive alien tea and trying to look like he belonged. The Rodari Syndicate bounty changed everything. The moment it was announced, the room turned dead silence, every Iliari elder exchanging measured, unreadable looks. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Carell sat at the head of the gathering, her expression carefully neutral, but Drake could see the calculation behind her eyes. "This is a declaration of intent," she said finally. Drake leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. "No kidding." A low murmur spread through the council. One elder, a thin, silver-marked man named Varas, glanced at Drake, his gaze sharp as a blade. "You have brought this danger to Ilvaris." Drake snorted. "Yeah, well, tell that to the slavers. Pretty sure they were the ones who started it when they tried to sell a kid in a cage." Another elder, a woman with deep green skin and piercing golden eyes, tapped her fingers against the table. "The Rodari do not issue bounties lightly. They will come, and they will come with force." Drake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, that's usually how these things work." Carell finally spoke, her voice steady, controlled. "We will not allow them to take him." Varas frowned. "You would risk war for an outsider?" Carl turned to him, golden eyes like burning embers. "He is not an outsider." The words landed heavier than Drake expected. A silence stretched across the chamber. Varos looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. Drake let out a slow breath, resisting the urge to shake his head. How the hell had this become his life? By nightfall, the city was on edge. The bounty wasn't just a problem for Drake, it was a threat to Ilvaris itself. The Rodari weren't the kind of enemy that sent a polite warning before striking. They would come fast, hard, and without mercy. Drake had no intention of hiding behind someone else's shield. He stood on the balcony of Carell's estate, staring out over the glowing city. The moons were high, casting pale silver light over the sprawling landscape. Below, Iliari warriors moved through the streets, reinforcing security measures, preparing for the inevitable. Drake clenched his fists. He'd spent his life running from fights like this. Getting involved had always been someone else's mistake. But not this time. Not here. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't have to turn to know it was Karel. "You're thinking about leaving?" she said. He exhaled. "I'd be an idiot if I wasn't." A pause, then quietly, "Are you?" Drake turned. She was watching him with that infuriating calm, her posture straight, hands folded in front of her, regal, controlled, unshaken. But her eyes? Her eyes betrayed her. She didn't want him to leave. Drake let out a slow breath, shoving his hands in his pockets. The Rodari aren't the type to play fair. They'll come, and they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Karel nodded. "We're prepared for that." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Lady, no offense, but you don't know what it's like to be hunted. To have every second feel like a countdown to the next fight. I've been through this before, and I can tell you, there's no preparing for it." She took a step forward. "Then stay and fight with us." Drake ran a hand through his hair, glancing away. "I don't." "You do," she interrupted. "You have already decided." Damn her. Damn her and her annoyingly accurate insight. Drake sighed, rubbing his temples. "I really hate how you do that." Karel smiled slightly. "I know." A familiar voice cut through the tension. "Are you two going to mate or fight?" Drake nearly choked on air. He spun to find Zyrek standing there, arms crossed, staring up at them with unimpressed amusement. Akaro remained composed. "You should be in bed." Zyrek shrugged. "Hard to sleep when you're waiting for an army to show up." Drake huffed. "Great. So now the kid's got my sense of humor too." Zyrek grinned. "I'm learning from the best." Before Drake could reply, a sudden blaring alarm cut through the quiet night. Drake's stomach dropped. Carol's communicator buzzed. She pressed a hand to her ear, listening. Then her expression hardened. "May hear." The Rodari syndicate didn't sneak in like thieves in the night. They came loud, a fleet of black ships cutting through the sky, descending on Ilvaris like a storm. Drake was already moving before anyone gave the order. The estate erupted into action, warriors rushing to defense positions, security shields flaring to life over key structures, weapons drawn. Karel strode beside him, her movements unshaken, controlled. "We will not let them set foot on this ground." Drake pulled out his blaster, checking the charge. "You got ships ready to intercept?" She nodded. "The planetary defense fleet is already engaging." Drake looked toward the sky. Flashes of green and red light erupted as the first wave of fighters clashed, streaks of plasma cutting through the darkness. The Rodari weren't here to negotiate. They were here to claim what they thought was theirs. Too bad for them. They had underestimated Ilvaris. Drake tapped his comm. "Zyrek, stay inside. Don't do anything stupid." Zyrek's voice crackled back, far too enthusiastic. "No promises." Drake cursed. The first Rodari dropships broke through the clouds, heading straight for the city's central plaza. Before they could land, ground cannons roared to life, sending blinding white streaks through the air. One dropship exploded mid-descent, debris scattering in a burning arc. The second one made it through, landing with a heavy metallic thud. The Rodari soldiers stormed out in tight formation, weapons raised. They weren't just slavers this time. These were mercenaries, enforcers, killers. Drake rolled his shoulders. "All right," he muttered. "Let's remind these bastards why picking a fight with a human is a terrible idea." Karel drew her own weapon, a sleek, curved energy blade, glowing faintly along its edges. "I intend to." And then the battle began. Drake moved fast, firing into the first wave before they could regroup. One mercenary dropped, Another reeled back, his armor sparking from the impact. Corel moved like a storm, weaving through the chaos with deadly precision, her blades slicing through armor like it was paper. The fight was fast, brutal, and unforgiving. But Ilvaris wasn't just defending itself. It was winning. Drake had been on the wrong side of battles like this before, outnumbered, overpowered, waiting for the moment things turned hopeless. But this time he was fighting for something worth staying for. And for the first time in his life, Drake Varen wasn't running. He was home. The battle for Ilvaris had been swift and brutal, but in the end, the Rodari never stood a chance. Their slavers and mercenaries had come expecting easy prey, thinking they were descending on a peaceful planet, too caught up in its own traditions to fight back. They had been wrong. The Iliari were not warriors by nature, but when their home and people were threatened, they became something else, a force that refused to break. They fought as one, moving with seamless coordination, their energy weapons cutting through the invaders before they could fully establish a foothold. Their defense fleet had intercepted most of the incoming ships before they even reached the ground, and the few that did land found themselves overwhelmed, outmaneuvered, and utterly defeated. By the time the last Rodari gunship retreated, the city was still standing, its people unshaken. Drake sat on the steps of Karel's estate, catching his breath as the embers of battle cooled. His knuckles were raw, his blaster was overheated, and his entire body ached from too many close calls, but somehow, against all odds, they had won. He exhaled, tilting his head back, watching the twin moons of Ilvaris hang motionless in the sky. The air smelled like burnt ozone and fresh earth, the sharp remnants of battle mixing with the natural scent of the city. Survivors gathered in small clusters, checking on each other, tending to wounds, offering silent embraces of relief. And then there was Karel. She stood just a few feet away, her energy blade still humming faintly in her grip. Her robe was torn, her hair was disheveled, but her golden eyes were steady, focused. She was unbreakable, even now, even after all of this. Drake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You fought like hell," he muttered. Karel turned to him, raising a brow. "Did you expect anything less?" Drake smirked. Not for a second. A familiar voice cut through the tension. "Did you see me?" Drake turned just in time to see Zyrek sprinting toward them, excitement glowing in his golden eyes. His tunic was dirt-streaked, his hair was a wild mess, and he had what looked like a stolen energy pistol strapped to his side. Drake's stomach dropped. "You better tell me that's not loaded," he said. Zyrek grinned far too wide. "It was. But I shot all the charges already." Karel inhaled deeply, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Zyrek," she said, in that dangerously calm voice all mothers had mastered. Zyrek blinked up at her, all innocence. "Yes, mother?" Her golden eyes narrowed. "We will discuss this later." The kid had the good sense to take a step back. Drake just shook his head, letting out a tired laugh. "Stars help me, you're going to be the death of me." Zyrek beamed. "You always say that, but you're still alive." Drake gave him a look. "Barely." Zyrek just grinned harder and, without hesitation, threw himself at Drake, wrapping small arms around his waist in a bone-crushing hug. Drake stiffened, caught off guard. Then, slowly, he let out a breath and rested a hand on the kid's back. This was the first time Zyrek had hugged him outright, without teasing or excuses. It wasn't just relief, it was trust. Karel watched them, something soft and unreadable in her gaze. Drake met her eyes over the top of Zyrek's head. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them. An understanding, unspoken but deeply felt. The Rodari had been defeated, but they weren't gone. This battle had been a warning shot, and Drake knew better than anyone that the Syndicate didn't forget a grudge. He had a choice. He could run, like he always had, leave Ilvaris behind, take Zyrek somewhere far away, keep moving until the Rodari gave up. But for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run. Ilvaris had become something he never thought he'd find. A place to belong. A place to fight for. He sighed, ruffling Zyrek's hair before gently prying him off. All right, kid. You gotta let go before I pass out on these steps. Zyrek stepped back, grinning proudly. Fine, but only if you admit I was amazing. Drake rolled his eyes. You were a menace, but yeah, you did good. Zyrek lit up. Carol exhaled. Do not encourage him. Drake smirked. Too late. Zyrek ran ahead to join a group of Ilyari children who had gathered near the city center. Drake watched him go, still feeling the ghost of his small arms around him. Then he turned to Karel. He could see it in her expression. She was waiting, not asking, not demanding, just waiting for him to make his choice. Drake let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. So I guess I need to figure out what my official title is around here, huh? Karel blinked, and for the first time ever he saw her actually look surprised. Then her lips curved into something that wasn't just amusement, wasn't just diplomacy, it was relief, something warmer, something real. She inclined her head. I believe that would be consort of the matriarch. Drake groaned. You're joking. Karel's smile widened slightly. I thought humans enjoyed humor. Drake dragged a hand down his face. You've been spending too much time around me. Perhaps. He huffed, shaking his head before glancing back at the damn near glowing city of Ilvaris, still standing despite everything. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. For once he wasn't looking for an exit. He was home. And for the first time in his life, that didn't scare him, it just felt right.